In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Gnosticism and the earliest church's problems with this movement. And we've separated Gnosticism from the other early Christian heresies, in part because it's both an important subject on its own, within the context of the earliest couple of centuries of the church, but also because Gnosticism continues to pop up here and there in modern scholarship and in even the popular awareness of the ancient church. And there's widespread confusion or misperception in some areas as to the nature of Gnosticism in the early church. And we can begin by noticing one of the earliest movements out of the earliest decades of the church that really is similar to Gnosticism on some key areas, but at least notices a trend in the early church towards a certain philosophical pre-commitment to certain opinions of the ancient world that caused some to challenge the traditional reading of Scripture. And the first thing we want to notice is a movement that had a short shelf life in terms of the early church, but which feeds into the ethos that gave rise to Gnosticism. And that movement is Docetism. In textbooks and lectures all the time, you'll hear someone being referred to as Docetic. And whenever someone uses that reference, they're usually not referring to someone as being a follower of Docetism. Rather, Docetic is a tendency in modern descriptions of Christ that is problematic. And in many ways, even referring to these views as Docetism is a bit of a misnomer. There was no Docetic church in the traditional sense of that word. Docetism doesn't achieve the level of adherence as, say, Arianism. Docetism, rather, is a tendency. It's a trend. And Docetism, to give a simple definition, is the belief that Christ could not have had a human body. A lot of the impulse for this is driven either by a philosophical commitment to certain views of the created world, or in some cases, it's driven by a commitment to somehow elevate Christ's divinity to the point that it sort of swallows up and makes irrelevant his humanity. Again, there is no Docetism movement. It's sometimes hard to put your finger on it. There is no great body of text of the Docetic church, this kind of thing. But for whatever reason, a certain number of people in the early church simply had trouble with reckoning with Christ as fully man. Now, that strikes us as a bit odd today in the modern 21st century because, in many ways, we have, in at least the popular culture, something of the opposite effect. Christ is just a man. He was a great teacher. He was a great leader, some might say, but there's no way he was God. Well, to many in the ancient church, it was patently obvious that a God could come down or a spiritual figure could come amongst us. But the idea that God would take on human flesh was, frankly, blasphemous to certain people. And so, on the one hand, you have a group of people who are philosophically committed to the idea that God would not take on human flesh. And what's lurking in this is usually a low view of creation, or it's usually a low view of us as humanity. Not to be overly simplistic, but the idea could be simply that they find human flesh icky. There's no way, to put it pejoratively, that God could defecate and bleed. That simply taints who he is. He's God. There's no way he becomes us. So that's the philosophical side of Docetism. On the other hand, there are those who trend towards a Docetic Christology, who do so usually by elevating and speaking so exaltedly of the divinity that even the more natural human nature of Christ gets lost or obliterated. In modern popular discussions of theology, whenever someone is being referred to as Docetic, or you have a Docetic trend in your understanding of Christ, this is usually what's meant. And I do think this is relatively popular amongst some in evangelicalism, particularly if they want to defend the divinity of Christ. Too often there are Docetic trends in the church, again, simply because they want to exalt one part of the story of Christ, and in doing so, they kill another part. What do I mean? Well, if you take, for example, the suffering of Christ, if you go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and there is Christ kneeling, asking that this cup pass from him, and then resigning himself to the situation, saying, "But thy will be done, and not my own." Well, I have heard it said here and there by usually lay folks who are trying to make sense of this passage. They'll say that that's simply not the case, that there's no way that Christ could have actually meant that he was fearful or anxious about the cross or the suffering he was about to endure. And I've heard people say he is simply describing the kinds of things that we might have said if we were going through that process. There's no way he felt fear. Well, that's the kind of thing we're talking about here, a docetic trend. The idea that divinity simply can't have a human nature with it, that Christ can't be somehow incarnated in a real live human body. And we're not really have to go into the modern concept of this right now, but we need to know that, again, this trend is always lurking somewhere out there. And this usually shows up in discussions of Christ's emotions or his human nature in general. If there's ever a tendency to downplay his humanity, that he was like us in every way except for sin, if that gets sort of pushed off the table, that's a real docetic move. Well, Docetism, to just describe these trends, really had a relatively short life in terms of its impact and its influence on the early church. Coming out of that same soup of ideas, though, there is the movement of Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism has a lot of popular misconceptions about it. One of the more important ones is that there was a time, about, say, a century ago, in which it was taken as axiomatically true that Gnosticism was a defined religion or a defined movement, and, more importantly, particularly in German scholarship, it was alleged that Gnosticism predated Christianity. You got a lot of talk in both scholarship and in the popular world of these mystery religions and cults and Gnosticism as all having elements that Christianity somehow just borrowed. And so Gnosticism was, again, believed to predate Christianity. And so elements within Gnosticism that appeared Christian, even if they were skewed or changed in some way, were believed to be some of the origins of Christian doctrine. Well, in the last, say, 50 to 75 years, so much of that has been exploded. The historical record simply does not show Gnosticism as existing before Christianity, but rather it comes after Christianity. And the main discovery that allowed us to really redate and retool our understanding of this is the discovery of the Nag Hammadi. The Nag Hammadi library was discovered by two brothers. They kept it under lock and key for a period of time after their discovery, but over time it became released, and today it is housed at the museum in Cairo. And what it gave to the world is a number of Gnostic texts and alternative gospels and biblical accounts that were derived from self-committed Gnostic trending folks who were uncomfortable with the scriptural teachings of Christ as Messiah, and so came up with a number of their own teachings and their own writings to support their positions. If any of you are aware of the ongoing debates by scholars such as Bart Ehrman and others who allege that there are so many texts and so much variety of early Christianity, that there really is no Christianity, properly speaking, no orthodoxy, properly speaking, until the Council of Nicaea. Well, if you are aware of that debate or those controversies that are going on, well, they're nothing new. We've known about these texts for quite some time. What's changed in the modern world is how they are interpreted and read in the light of early Christianity. And so these arguments that are being made today are often based on not so much scholarship as it is interpretation and opinion. Still, what we want to be careful with here, again, as with Docetism, is that we don't make Gnosticism a religion full stop or a philosophy full stop. Gnosticism is not simply a single set of beliefs that was adhered to and you were initiated into. Rather, there are trends. Gnosticism has a certain impulse within it on a number of fronts theologically. And more people are beginning to become aware of the diversity of opinion within Gnosticism. And that's really not too much of a problem. The issue was, in the past, is that all we really had to go on when we were discussing Gnosticism, let's say 150 years before the discovery of the Nag Hammadi, all we really had to discuss Gnosticism were the books that countered Gnosticism amongst Orthodox Christians. Take one of the great examples of this, Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus was a bishop. He lived in Gaul, which is in the modern sort of southern France, Swiss regions. And Irenaeus turned his guns on the Gnostic movements as a whole in his book Against the Heresies. And for Irenaeus, Gnosticism is a single movement, and he describes, at least in general, the overall tone of Gnosticism as a single group. And historians, particularly in the last 25 years, have done a good job of at least adding some color and variety to our understanding of Gnosticism, based in large part on our understanding of the Nag Hammadi, as well as other research that's going on. And so we don't want to stumble into using Irenaeus too much and describing Gnosticism, again, as a single philosophy. But we also want to be careful that the presence of a variety of different opinions doesn't somehow seize us up or cause us anxiety when we attempt to describe the philosophy of Gnosticism as a general movement. Well, who are the Gnostics? Simply put, the Gnostics are a group of people that have a set of philosophies and views related to the created world, salvation, and the life of the believer. The word Gnostic actually comes from the Greek root word gnosis, or gnostikos, which just simply means knowledge. A Gnostic was someone who believed that he or she had a certain enlightenment or a certain spiritual knowledge that only they had because they were part of this Gnostic faith. And it's important to note that Gnosticism and another movement called Manichaeanism in this period essentially is what I call a smorgasbord philosophy. When you look at Gnosticism, it has elements of Christianity within it, but it is purposely setting itself over and against the Christian church and over against the Christian scriptures. And one of the ways that it does so is by grabbing and pulling from other philosophies, religions, and viewpoints of the ancient world. Gnosticism, in other words, is an amalgam. And given that it comes after Christianity, and given that many of its texts seek to correct or edit or change elements of the scriptural accounts as we know them of the Christian scriptures, it's not much of a stretch to say that Gnosticism is a purposeful heresy. Now, I define heresy very, very specifically here. Evangelicalism has sort of gotten off whack with this word. We use heresy to describe anything we don't like. But a heresy in the ancient world, and the way I'm using it now, is any purposeful or willful attempt to change things, whether it's through deeper explanation of how something works that gets you off point, or in the case of Gnosticism, it's simply an aversion to the basic orthodox teachings as they're found in the scriptures. And even if we're talking about periods in which not all of the scriptures had circulated and the canon had not yet congealed into what we know it as today, still, the presence of so many of these counter-gospels and counter-texts that change the very nature of the ethos of the scriptural teachings signals to us that what's going on in Gnosticism is not oral traditions that have somehow arisen and changed over time, and therefore are just as valid as any old Christianity as we know it, but rather they are conscientiously reacting against Scripture. Well, what are they reacting against? Well, the core of Gnosticism in general is a collection of opinions that focus essentially on shunning the material world. The core of it, in other words, is something like a mystical belief or a dualism between the material order and the spiritual order. Now, that word dualism is often fought over. Some argue that some Gnosticisms don't have dualism, that they're sort of a monism of material orders and spiritual orders. But I mean dualism here somewhat benignly. For most Gnostics, for most who are followers of this trend, they simply have an aversion to the material world. In fact, one of the big things that is very, very common in Gnosticism is the development of creation myths or creation stories about how the created world got made. It is not made, in other words, through the creation of a benevolent God who makes creation and then man in his image. In most Gnostic stories, it's an evil God or some kind of low-ranked deity who fumbles and bumbles into creating the natural order. Well, just as Gnostics have a problem with the created world or with the physical world, they also have an alternative view of salvation. For most Gnostics, salvation is some form of self-denial, some sort of ascetic life that they believed led them to some sort of enlightenment, some sort of deeper spiritual awareness. Now, that actually makes some sense. If the physical world is a lie, if our bodies lie to us, if our lusts and our passions are some of the things that are evidence of the evil of this created world, well, denying them, fasting, sexual abstinence, these kinds of good works are said to lead one down a path of spiritual enlightenment, hence the name Gnostics as being the ones of knowledge. Well, if that's the essential core of it, I think in the end there are what I like to call three Gnostic fundamentals that we can all appreciate and understand, at least the impulses within Gnosticism, even if we understand that there is a great deal of variety on some of these points as to how they're employed and these kinds of things. And these three Gnostic fundamentals are also important, I think, because just like Docetism, you occasionally in today's world hear someone referring to something as being Gnostic. And what they mean by that is usually something of the following three elements that is present in most Gnostic movements, as somehow peeking its head up in modern Christianity. And I'll say more about that in just a second once I lay out these three fundamentals. Well, the first fundamental is simply that the world isn't real. It's a bit like the Matrix, actually. The real world around you is not the real world. It's ephemeral and it's lying to you. Now, a lot of the impulse for this is, frankly, some sort of derivative of Platonic ideas of the material world, which we looked at in a previous lecture on pagan ideas. It was just something in the water with the ancient world, where they didn't find the material world around us to be all that pleasurable or to be all that reliable. There was always the belief that there was something better out there, beyond the world, in some sort of spiritual ethos. Well, with Gnostics, they're not Platonic in the full sense, but they pick up on this idea and they really leverage it to the fullest extent that you can. The material world isn't real. In fact, in many ways, it's evil. Now, this is a position about knowledge. This is not necessarily first and foremost about the created world. When they argue that the world isn't real, what they mean is there's no truth to be discovered within it. Truth is enlightenment. It's some sort of mystical experience of something beyond this world. There's nothing to be learned of truth in this world. And you can see something of an analogy to this in some of the neo-pagan, New Agey movements today. This sort of seeking after nirvana, this idea of spiritual enlightenment as trumping anything that we can really access in this world. And Gnosticism really does sort of fit within that. It's kind of a mushed-up version of a bunch of different philosophies, but in terms of how it comes to greater knowledge, it is some sort of spiritual, mystical enlightenment that really doesn't hold firmly to this world at all. The second Gnostic fundamental, as I call it, flows out of that first one, and it is hatred of the material world. This is specifically about creation. And by hatred of it, I mean, again, that it's somewhat icky, it's somewhat gross. That written into the DNA of every physical thing of this created world is something rotten. And I always tell students that this has sort of a ring to Star Wars in it. Yes, Star Wars. I was watching the movie once, and I noticed that when Luke is sitting there with Yoda, and he's discussing the Force and the philosophy behind it, that Yoda at one point plucks on Luke's shoulder and says, "Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter." And he says, "You must feel the Force around you." And he says it in that Yoda voice, which I'm not going to try to impersonate. But notice that phrase, "Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter." That is sort of an analogy to the ethos of Gnosticism. And it's no surprise, actually, because George Lucas actually draws from a great number of these typical sort of ancient religions when he's creating his views of the Force. Okay, Star Wars geek off. Anyway, the point, though, here is a way to remember it. There is a great deal of this type of thing out there in the world today, at least amongst religions or even amongst Christians who are well-intentioned but somehow get it wrong. This belief that evil, that sin, is somehow physical or it's related to our physical bodies. This is one of the core essentials of a generally Gnostic approach to faith in general. And the third and the last core conviction of, frankly, all Gnostics is what I call elitist knowledge or secret knowledge. And what I mean by this is there is no major impulse within Gnosticism to spread or evangelize. They really see themselves as elite. They see themselves as having some sort of mystical, personal, spiritual knowledge that only they can access. It's something just for them. There's no widespread evangelism movement. They want to be left alone, these kinds of things. And yes, I have a modern analogy for this one as well. If you look at the movements today in modern America of Scientology and Kabbalah, both of these have heavy representation in Hollywood, in certain areas of the upper crust of the elites, people of wealth and means. Well, when was the last time someone from the Scientology church came to your door with tracts trying to convert you? They don't have that. In fact, Scientology privileges itself on not sharing its core convictions or its philosophies. There are all kinds of conspiracy theories about it, these kinds of things. And Scientology isn't what I care about, or Kabbalah. But that impulse is still there. And it's frankly one of the same impulses that's in Gnosticism. This idea that if you're a Gnostic, you're one of the Gnostikos. You're one of those who have the knowledge. And therefore you are privileged and elite, and you don't really want to share this with other people. You want to meet in secret in some ways. Well, again, those are the three core convictions. And so I want to say just one thing. Whenever you hear someone in the modern world referring to something as being Gnostic, what they're referring to is Not that someone is a full-blown Gnostic. Instead, frequently what is happening when someone refers to a modern person as being Gnostic is it's someone reacting against a noticed trend within, in particular, evangelicalism, that has a really harsh dualism between spiritual things and the everyday things, or in some cases, the soul and the body. I noticed this actually recently in the sort of Twitter battle that people got into, where someone rather famous, I won't say who, put out a quote that they believed was from C.S. Lewis. And this is not from C.S. Lewis, by the way. He never said this. And the quote I saw was that you are not a body that has a soul, but you are a soul that happens to have a body. And someone put this out on social media, and all kinds of people reacted and said, how dare you be a Gnostic and say these kinds of things? Well, what do they mean? Well, just take that quote. You are not a body that happens to have a soul. You are a soul that happens to have a body. Well, is that the teachings of Genesis 1-3? That we were somehow created as a soul and then we just happen to have a body? Of course not. When someone says something that sounds pious, but it privileges one side of us over the other, that's really what people mean when they call it Gnostic. And I do think this is something to be on guard for in practical ministry. I think there's too many people out there that believe that spiritual things are some kind of mystical and sort of sitting around and thinking sort of spiritual, and that the everyday features of life and creation and the joys of this world are somehow all lying to us. And you see this repeatedly throughout church history in hyper-ascetic, moralistic tendencies within either the Middle Ages or in Protestantism itself. You can see this, for example, in how we raise our kids or our views of our own marriage. When I was running college ministry, I always had some bozo come up to me and say, well, I love God, but I don't think I want to fall in love and get married because I think if I loved a human too much, it might somehow detract from my love of God. These kind of things. And without a doubt, they always found the one that they would fall in love with, and that idea went right out the window. But still, the impulse to somehow forsake the natural created world as somehow being more highly spiritual. These are the groups that I call life-denying, fun-denying, kind of curmudgeonly ascetic groups, and they're everywhere. They're not just in Protestantism. That's what people mean when they generally call something modern as being sort of Gnostic. So the jargon helps in some ways to at least know what people's concerns are. Well, when you look at those three things, it's really not much of a challenge to realize how Orthodox Christianity, even just a simple reading of the scriptures themselves, really explodes so much of this. I've already said, creation itself is good. God repeatedly refers to it as good. The things that are tedium and evil and stressful in this world is a result of sin, not creation itself. Take John, right in the beginning. I always usually walk students through the reading of John more slowly, but let me just do it quickly with us. If you go down the verses of John 1, you can see how they can be read Gnostically. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, these kinds of things. And then you move on down, and then John, with a hammer, says, and the Word became flesh. Well, that's not a shot at Gnosticism, but you could understand why Gnostics would read that and cringe. Now, the impulse within Gnosticism, again, is threefold. First, that there is nothing in this world that can give us truth. It's always somehow outside and learned through something like mysticism. Second, this world is corroded and the physical created world is wrong. And third, that there is some kind of secret knowledge that is to be kept to oneself.